Oh, and we are back. And I actually kind of like the way this episode might go, considering that it's a bit of an assortment of topics to a certain degree, but interestingly enough, it's all about dating. So yeah, this episode is about dating, although it's gonna have an assortment of things like sex talk, a bit of age talk, maybe a bit of, if I was married type talk might come through as well, but fortunately I won't really get into marriage, which is a relief for me because I usually don't like getting into those. And, normally for me, I like to avoid talking about it unless it's absolutely necessary, which in the case of this first thing that I need to talk about is one of those necessary situations, because there is a man on Twitter who came out and spoke about how he divorced his wife because she withheld sex and they had had sex only twice in 2 years. Twice in 2 years. Even by celibacy standards, that's a lot. Nigga is like 34 pumps away from being an actual monk at this point. Twice in 2 years. Was the guy getting it once a year during Christmas as like his Christmas gift? Like Santa will come down the chimney just to say my Santa will go into yours or some shit like that. Because I'm finding it hard to believe. Twice in 2 years.
The royal penis is clean, Your Highness.
Honestly, I feel like if this guy didn't engage in any sexual activity with anything or anyone, including himself, during that 2-year period, this guy would probably be a mentor in the nofap community. Like, this guy would be the one to bring back the proof over whether you not doing it for a bit of a while will allow you to levitate or some shit. Like, this guy's situation is one of the toughest I've heard in a while, even though I know that this is something that does tend to happen to quite a lot of married guys. But before I can talk too much about that, let me just get into the entire breakdown of this entire story. So it says, and I quote, on Twitter, a man made a public declaration that he will never again negotiate sexual terms within the context of a marriage. He divorced because of this reason. As a result, women withholding sexual activity for him until he complies with their demands. He claims that men are feeling miserable. It was a private hell, according to his description. According to him, there are an excessive number of women in the world who provide sexual services without any constraints attached. Despite the fact that he fulfilled his duties as a husband and a father in his family, he was unable to obtain sexual closeness from his wife. It's only going to make you suffer, according to him, if your sexual activities held at the end of a fishing pole for the sake of compliance. End quote. Okay, I can get exactly what dude is saying, and it's very unfortunate that there's a lot of women that actually do this to their men. Like the whole withholding sex because they're pissed off or because they're feeling some type of way towards the guy. Not that there's anything particularly wrong with her. She just chooses to withhold sex just for the sake of withholding it or because she wants something from the guy. Like, it's something that I find to be quite, I'm not going to say juvenile because it's mostly married women that do it, but it's usually just quite wrong. And I'm fortunate that at least in some places, the justice system recognizes conjugal rights as an actual reason to, I don't know if it's annul the marriage or actually like consider divorce. And to be quite honest, like, I'm not saying that guys need sex to survive, but hey, like a good chunk of the reason why so many men used to get married back in the day was because of sex. So you know that it's important, so why hold it back? And in this particular guy's case, it's even more surprising because it started 4 years after he had had kids. 4 years, because I managed to actually go and look at his tweets. He mentioned that all of this started 4 years after the kids. Like, last I had checked, and I could probably be wrong about this, you're very welcome to tell me whether I'm right or wrong about it. Usually, after a couple of years, a woman's sex drive actually goes up. It's actually supposed to go up after you've been dating for a couple of years. Reason being, it's a way that the female body exercises mate retention by having more sex with a guy so that he doesn't want to go and have sex with other women. Like, I'm not saying that, there's a certain set point it's supposed to start, but normally it comes in as a form of mate retention. So the fact that after all of those years, like having kids and everything, and then there's 4 years of not having kids, and then all of a sudden Shorty's closing the tap, like, that does seem particularly concerning. But unfortunately, I can't go too deep into my concerns on the entire thing because I do have an episode I should have started in a much better way with a little bit more pizzazz, with an intro that would have sounded like, Welcome to the Break Time Podcast, where I talk about love, sex, and relationships from a guy's perspective, as well as a bunch of other guy shit. The man on the mic is a man who not only appreciates but enjoys the practice of the conjugal arts. He's a man who believes that astrology should have been the study of ass. It is none other than your tall, dark, and mildly handsome man, Sir Denver B. This episode started in one of the weirdest ways because normally you'd think that I would want to start the episode with why men and women should stay together, but I've practically started the episode with one of the examples why some men will end up practicing extramarital affairs, which is usually a little bit odd. I'm a little bit more of the let's keep it in the relationship, let's keep it in the marriage type thing, but when you read things like these, you sort of kind of understand why some guys just end up cheating. Like, I'm not saying that I endorse it or that I support it or anything, it's just I can understand why some guys can end up doing it. And the problem is, like I've mentioned one guy, but there's definitely hundreds, if not even thousands of guys that go through these exact same issues on a day-to-day. But anyways, all the doom and gloom aside, I hope that whatever relationship or marriage you get into, you will have someone that is very, very sexually active and enjoys doing it with you, or at least will understand your situation regardless of the issues that are there, and you guys will live in harmony. But all in all, we have an episode to do, and because this is a Friday episode, I usually like to go into Twitter and look through a bunch of tweets, break them down a little bit, and it's on these Friday episodes where I usually like your input quite a bit, because I usually don't even talk about stuff that I generate myself or come up with myself. I usually like to reach out to the world and pull up some of the things that you've said. And if you want to send in some tweets so that we can discuss them, then the drill is pretty simple, almost sounds like a song, and it goes like this. You see that tweet, you like that tweet, you want us to discuss that tweet, you send that tweet. You send it to the DMs of @BagakaTheD, which happens to be my personal X handle, and I will take it from there and handle it accordingly. On Facebook and on IG, if it happens to be a screenshot, a screen grab, or it ended up on a reel, then the place to send it to is @TheBreaktime_podcast on IG and @TheBreaktime_podcast on Facebook, and I will take it from there and I will handle it accordingly. Now, I have a couple of tweets that I need to get into, but before I can do any of that, I want to start things off by talking about the idea of domestication. Now, while I know that different social media runs on different algorithms and those algorithms will change our preferences and what we watch and shit, I know that there's quite a number of people who've noticed that there's been a lot of housewife and wife cooking content, quote unquote the domesticated woman type content, which has really been popping up quite a bit on TikTok. I've noticed a bit on YouTube and also some on IG. And when I noticed this content initially, I was like, well, I guess this is probably just wholesome content for babes. But I've actually noticed that there's a lot more women that are getting into it, and there's actually been quite the uptick in this content being made, meaning that it's probably trending and people are just hopping on the bandwagon. And I'm not the only person who noticed. There was someone on Twitter who did notice this, and they said, and I quote, "I'm seeing more and more women endorsing the quote-unquote domesticated woman. The system is self-correcting," end quote. And when I read this, at first I could get why there's a lot of guys that would think this, that the system itself is self-correcting and the traditional woman is coming back. And honestly, in my opinion, I don't think it's a correction. I feel like it's more of an overcorrection than an actual correction itself. Mostly because, I'm looking at the way a lot of these women are pulling the whole domesticated woman look and trend and videos, and honestly, it seems very unmanageable for the average person. But still, you look at some of the shit that they're doing. There's women that are making 3-course meals from scratch, and by from scratch, I mean they're not buying pasta from the supermarket. They're making that shit with dough, and they're making the rolls, and they're cutting it up. And they're making full-on gourmet meals in 3-course meal fashion. And honestly, much as all of that's great to see, and you also see them doing a little bit of cleaning here and there, it definitely does kind of seem like, maybe the traditional woman is coming back. But honestly speaking, when I look at it, I feel like it's more of an overcorrection, because if you kind of look back at it, feminism created what we now know as the quote-unquote modern woman, this whole working class babe that's, trying to be independent and scaling up the corporate ladder, and is trying to get to this point where they have this independence and the freedom and they don't need the man to take care of them and shit like that. That was what the original idea of the modern woman was. And that seemed all great when women were getting opportunities and shit, but it seems like there's a lot of young babes that came up and noticed that this shit is just not for them, as well as a couple of older women who also realized that, there's definitely fulfillment in like actually taking care of your man and being at home. And then now this is like the overcorrection, because there's a bunch of women that do not want to be in the corporate world, do not want to deal with that kind of BS, and they just want to stay home and be taken care of and become the housewife. Which is actually a big part of the reason why nowadays you're seeing more and more people engaging in the usefulness of the housewife debate. Because people previously used to look down upon the housewife, but nowadays people are like, oh, being a housewife is actually pretty hard. It's a very demanding job. You don't get pay, you don't get benefits, and it's full time. There's no clock in, clock out, blah, blah, blah. And yet, if you asked people 10 years ago whether they'd like to be a housewife, 9 out of 10 young women would have said, no, fuck that shit. I want to make my own money. But now, after years of trying to do whatever it is that they said that they're doing, and I guess maybe you could say economic challenges and like just the challenges of adulting and shit, you're seeing more and more women trying to rush towards being the domesticated wife. And by all means, like, it's not a bad idea. If I was a woman, I'd probably be rushing for the same thing as well. The only thing is, I don't think it's entirely sustainable or possible for the vast majority of women out here these days, because the average man's income is barely enough to sustain most people, let alone a family. And even though you include 2 incomes, you're probably going to have to stretch the bills a little bit to take care of the 2 people, and then you throw in like 1 or 2 kids on top of that. So it doesn't seem as possible for a lot of women. By all means, I'm not saying that it's impossible, it's more improbable than impossible. But for the most part, I feel like what we're going to end up with, at least with the current Gen Z's women, is going to be a hybrid of the domesticated wife as well as the modern woman, which is kind of where our mothers kind of came in when, they were the working class wives that would go and kill it in the office, but also come back home and be really, really great moms and good wives and so on and so forth. Now, of course, I might be wrong about this, and personally, I feel like that's my idea of what the correction is. But to be quite honest, when I look at the current economic situation and I look at how Gen Z and the millennials are on a financial level, I feel like the hybrid is the most plausible thing. The vast majority of women aren't going to become domesticated, so they're just gonna have to fall somewhere in the middle. Although, with that said, I am going to leave it at that because I have the rest of the tweets that I need to get into. So, on to our very first tweet of this episode, and this one came from a woman who seemed to see no sense with men and age gaps when she said, and I quote, "Men over 30 sleeping with girls barely 20 will never make sense to me. Like, your age mates don't want you, or what's the problem, uncle?" End quote. And okay, so I've talked about this on the podcast more than once, and I have sort of given my views on it, whereby I've spoken about the difference between legality and morality, whereby, anyone who's above the age of 18 is fair game to just about any adult, but it doesn't mean that on a moral level, it should be pursued by every single adult, regardless of age. And, I've given my thoughts on this, but when it comes to my actual view on men over 30 going for women like this, can I really say that there's no sense in it? No, there's actually some sense to it, and maybe it's because she's not a guy, so she wouldn't really see the sense. Do I find it weird? Yes, but do I see the sense that can come from it? Definitely, because on a statistical level, women are considered the most beautiful, or at least the most beautiful age or the most attractive age for most women is usually somewhere around 21 and 24 years old, statistically speaking. So you will find that if a woman is considered more attractive within that age, then definitely there's going to be more people that will be gunning for that age range, which is where the guys who are over 30 will kind of come in. Especially if they have a little bit of extra bank, then they can definitely do that. On top of that, when you look at the possibility of going for someone who's around your age that you've probably seen for years, till you've gotten tired of, the concept of going for a 21, 22-year-old can add a little bit of novelty, a little bit of nuance. So technically, the whole idea of quote-unquote fresh meat does appeal to quite some guys. And also, there's some guys that definitely want a babe that doesn't question them, that doesn't challenge them per se. So going for someone who's a lot younger and has, quite the age gap from where they are definitely works to their favor. Because when a 37-year-old man is busy talking to a 21-year-old babe, then there's a pretty good chance if he tells her to do something, she'll probably respect him quite a bit, because that age gap does kind of give him some level of dominance fresh out the jump. Now, of course, I said that I felt like it was a little bit weird, just mostly because I feel like when you have that big of an age gap, there's not that much relating that you guys are going to do. And especially when you're from two different generations, so like around my age range, like when I look at it, there's a millennial that's going for a Gen Z, because there's no millennial who's under the age of 26, 27. So for the most part, like that generational difference might mean that you guys don't entirely understand each other on a lot of things. So for example, if you're like 35 years old, maybe you've decided to relax with a couple of your boys. You don't want to, move around too many different clubs. You just meeting up with 4 or 5 of your friends at the pub and just chilling and having a beer seems like a pretty good idea for you. That's your idea of a chill time. For her, it could be going out to the club and moving from club to club as y'all are chasing the next best party spot for the night, whatever time it is. And that might not work for the guy who's like 35 years old, because he just wants to chill and relax. But you're finding that there's going to be a bit of a disconnect, because on both ends, there's very different ideas of how to spend a fun or a nice weekend with your friends. And, that can create a bit of a disconnect there. But at the same time, the both of you can choose to accept each other for who you are, and, you decide to, let the other person do what they want to do, provided that the both of you love each other and stay together. And that can work. That can definitely work. But I also want someone that I would want to bounce ideas off of, and I'd want to do that with someone who's at least towards the same level mentally. And when I'm with someone who's like a decade younger than me, then that kind of becomes a little bit hard to do. So personally, for me, I feel like it's a little bit weird for you to go for someone that's 15 years or junior. But then again, that's just me, and maybe if I get to the 30s, maybe I'll have a different outlook on it. But for now, I'm just gonna leave it as is and move it on to our next tweet of the episode. So it says, and I quote, "Recently, Kenyan men on Twitter were saying they'd not be mad at their dads if they suddenly married a 27-year-old while deep in their 50s and 60s. The unspoken part was, it's because they hope that they themselves will pull 27-year-olds when they're in their 50s. Dream on, karaoke." End quote. Now, I can't speak for all the Kenyan men on Twitter. I also can't speak for a bunch of Kenyan men on Twitter, or even most. Personally, my thoughts on this would be very different. Like, if my father, who's currently in his 60s, decided to go for a 27-year-old, personally, I'd be pissed. Just mostly because I have a great relationship with my mom, and I'd hate how that would hurt my mom for my dad to just drop her and suddenly go for some 27-year-old chick. Like, for me, it's not even about the whole, she's old enough to be my sister, like this girl is young enough to be your daughter, blah blah. Nah, like, it's not even about that. It's literally just, I'd hate how that would hurt my mom. But assuming that you could take that out of the picture, assuming that they decided to go their own separate ways, God forbid, and he decides to go for a 27-year-old, the next thing that'll annoy me is the fact that if at some point in the future, after she's probably gotten a kid by him, he dies, all of a sudden we'd end up being forced to share the wealth that our family has worked through, has toiled through, has gone through shit to kind of grow, and just share it with someone who just came in after, you had already crossed the finish line. Like, that would annoy me quite a bit. And even though I'd have my own wealth, even though I can stack up my own dough, at the end of the day, we worked through the years. We stayed and held on and stuck together through all of those years to build up a bunch of shit that we would probably like to give to our kids and possibly even grandkids. And for that to have to be shared out in a massive chunk to someone who just came in the other day will seem like an absolute kick in the plums. Now, if you were to take those situations out of the entire subject, and let's say, we know that the inheritance is not going to her and my mom is perfectly okay with it, honestly, I wouldn't give too much of a flying shit. Like, don't get me wrong, I definitely feel some type of way at first, and it'll take me a while to get accustomed to the person, but at the end of the day, that's his relationship, not mine. And in as much as it hurts me, if my father's happy and my dad made that choice to be with that person, it's not like I'm going to decide, I'm gonna be okay with it because when I'll be at his age, I'll be able to pull the same kind of babes. Nah, like, if I'm at that age, I'm hoping that I can pull whatever babes I can, but I'm perfectly okay bypassing the 27-year-old and going for a 40-year-old that's way less stress, requires a lot less, probably than one kids, and that's hoping by that time I'll have already had my kids and all, and at that point, we'll literally just be enjoying each other's company for the rest of our years. Like, that one I'd probably be a lot happier with. But for what it's worth, I don't think guys usually think of their dads dating younger women with the mindset of, if I'm at that age, I can pull the same kind of babes. Nah, like, niggas don't do that. Like, us guys look at things from a little bit more of a logical perspective, which is why there's a lot of guys that would be perfectly okay, or at least they wouldn't be mad with their father dating a much younger babe. But then again, that's just my analysis of it, so I am going to leave that there and move it on to our very final tweet of this episode, which was also put up by a woman. Interestingly enough, all of these tweets are coming from women. And it says, and I quote, "Unpopular opinion. Men trap women with a baby more than women do to men." End quote. Okay, now this is what I refer to as a stack of bullshit. It makes almost zero logical sense for a guy to want to trap a babe more than a babe wanting to trap a guy. Now, don't get me wrong, I know that there are guys that actually trap babes with kids, and not only do I know, I have covered an entire episode with it as a main topic where I have discussed guys who actually actively try to trap a babe with a kid. So I know it happens. I definitely know that it does. But when you look at a lot of the oops babies that exist out here, when you look at a lot of the single parent households that exist out here, I feel like most guys would probably avoid the kid, if not delay it or have it with another woman as opposed to the person they're with right now. Like, for the most part, I can just do a ballpark estimate and say probably about 70% of the guys who've gotten kids out of wedlock probably didn't even want the kids initially, but because the babe decided to keep the kid, they were like, alright, fine, it's beyond my control, so let's just do what it is that we can do. Like, there's a shit ton of guys that did not want a kid that ended up having a kid, not because they wanted to have a kid or even that the babe wanted to have the kid initially, but because the babe decided to keep the kid. And that goes hand in hand with the women that also want to have the kid by the guy even though the guy isn't comfortable with it, which is not too far off from when a babe is the one trapping the guy. So for the most part, considering the kind of financial pressure you go through as a guy, considering the amount of turmoil that you go through before you become a father and when you become a father, and considering the fact that there's a lot of guys that just end up becoming a father when they're super unprepared, I feel like the vast majority of people that do the trapping are usually the women. Mostly because for us guys, it makes very little logical sense, at least today, to have children. Logically speaking, financially speaking, it's not a good idea to have kids. So for most of the people that choose to have kids in today's day and age, at least, for a lot of them, it's probably because it's just a part of life that they've always been conditioned to, or they intend on having someone to leave a legacy with, or they were emotionally driven to want to have some sort of thing with the other person, and they were like, you know what, I'd love it if we had a kid together. Like, don't get me wrong, in as much as dudes are like, I'd want to put a baby in her, I don't think most guys would want to actually have the baby with the babe. But anyways, then again, maybe I might be wrong about this. Maybe there's a shit ton of guys that are doing whatever it takes to make a babe get pregnant. I want your thoughts on it. The DMs are open. On X, it is at Bagaka the D. On Facebook, it is at The Breaktime Podcast. And on IG, it is at The Breaktime_podcast. Thank you so much for listening all the way till the end. And I will catch you guys on the next break.
But what I believe is that if you put a pastor and a prostitute in one room, one is likely to convert the other.